I know.
Not had it in
ready,
honor
Amy?
of Roberta.
Yes, sir, I am.
They're all little, I mean, they're just little charter tweaks.
Okay, we are back in session and continuing with the Education, Innovation, and Charter Schools Committee, so I'll turn to Ms. White.
Thank you, Chair Davis, and I promise not to overstay my welcome any more than what is required. So we are now talking about our charter schools. We already discussed EICS 9. Let's go all the way back up to EICS 1 with our charter school program grant, and I'll call on Dave Machado to walk us through that. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Do you want me to discuss the program grant?
Yes, sir.
That's we talked about that at the last meeting.
Yeah.
But, and so it's on today's agenda or tomorrow's agenda to vote on it. That was the CSP
Yes.
program grant that you are approving the timeline in our application.
Correct. So if there aren't any other
Unless any questions.
board comments, we don't have to go back through that presentation.
Okay.
Any questions?
Deanna.
Okay, if there aren't any questions on the charter school program grant and the timeline that we discussed last month, let's skip down to, now we're on EICS 5, the charter school annual report. Mr. Machado.
Good afternoon. I am Dave Machado, the Director of the Office of Charter School, and I'm going to talk to you today about our annual report that is due to the General Assembly February 15th. To give you a quick overview, we currently have 184 charter schools, and you can see over 109,000 students. If of all the students that are in public schools, 7.3 attend a charter school. We have 22 charter schools that are in their planning year. 10 of those are the accelerated applicants that Alex talked to you about earlier. We have 35 charter schools that CSAB is vetting right now, so we are quickly going to be approaching 200 charter schools. We had 11 charter schools that were up for renewal last year. 9 got 10-year renewals, 2 got a 3-year renewal. This year, we're currently have 34 charter schools that are up for renewal. And our renewal process is a 2-year process. We make visits and do a lot of data analyzing the first year, then we make the recommendation to the Charter School Advisory Board, and they will vote on it. Matter of fact, of the 34 schools that are up for renewal, CSAB will be discussing them next week, and we'll be bringing that back to you in February. As you can see, our demographics is trending in the right direction. Everybody is very focused on that. For the last 4 years, it has increased. Our student of color has gone over right at 45%. Very proud of that demographic. You can see our economically disadvantaged population is also increasing. It increased from 30.6% in 16-17 to 33.2% last year. And also the number of charter schools that are earning a D or an F has decreased. We're still obviously not where we want to be, but we're very pleased that that number is decreasing every year. And the number of charter schools that have exceeded growth increased from 36 in 16-17 to 46 in 17-18. There's a chart showing the breakdown of our number of schools and where they fell on that chart from A to F. And this is our chart on growth. And you can see that 31% of our schools did not meet growth, which we are working very hard with that. But I do want to mention, out of that 53 schools that did not meet growth, 36 of them were not low performing. 2 of our A schools didn't meet growth, 9 of our B schools did not meet growth, and 25 of our C schools did not meet growth. So while we know that growth is an indication of what our charter schools are doing with our students, we are again continually working hard to help our schools with that. This is a comparison of how our elementary, middle, and high school students are compared to traditional district schools in language arts. You can see our elementary, middle, and high school. And this is the subgroups, how our schools are doing in a subgroup. And this subgroup is only elementary. I didn't want to put all 3 charts up every single time. The data is on page 12 for middle school and high school, but you can see how our schools are comparing to the local district schools in our subgroups. In every one of these subgroup categories charts that I'm going to show you, really pleased that our students, that English as a second language, and students with disability, we are not doing as well as we want to do, but we are, in comparison to the districts, we're doing well, but it's another place where we want to continue to improve on. This is our science comparison for elementary, middle, and high school. And also our subgroup comparison for science. Again, just elementary, our middle school and high school is on page 16 of your report. This is mathematics, how our charter schools are comparing to the district for middle, elementary, and high. And this is what our subgroup is for elementary. And again, on page 14, you can get what our middle school and high school schools are doing. On this slide, you'll see how our schools are doing with the ACT. All 11th graders in North Carolina take the ACT in the 11th grade. So then that is showing how our charter schools are performing. That's a great indication that our 55 to 60 charter high schools are preparing our students for post-secondary education. There's always discussions about charter school accountability, and I think it's important that we not confuse accountability with regulations and regulatory creep. But I wanted to go over a little bit of what the accountability is in our charter schools. Every one of our charter school boards and schools are subject to open meeting laws and Public Records Act. Every one of our board members, faculty, staff have to undergo a background check. Charter schools are required to abide by their charter agreement. If there's a charter school that when you granted them the charter and they started deviating from what was agreed upon, they either have to come back to Charter School Advisory Board and then the State Board of Ed for an amendment, which you guys regularly do hear these amendments, or they have to start complying with their charter. We spend a lot of time monitoring that and making sure that our schools are doing what the contract said that they would do. All our students are required to take the state mandated assessments, the EOGs and the EOCs. And our low performing and continuing low performing schools are required to appear before CSAB every year. And at that meeting, they have to explain what their school improvement plan is. And CSAB will comment on whether that is a good plan or it's not a good plan. Our office makes visits to our low performing schools every year, and we do a series of professional developments throughout the year for low performing schools, as does DPI that we partner with. every charter school that we have has to have an annual financial audit. That's done sometime during the summer, and it's due October 31st. And auditor has to be an approved LGC approved auditor. We have what's called an annual performance framework, which DPI and our office monitor the governance, academic, and financial compliance of our schools. And then we also have a very rigorous charter renewal process. Any school that is going through a renewal will tell you that we do some deep dives into their data, and when we meet with them, we talk about it. And we also, any charter high school that we have, we ask Power School to do a transcript audit to make sure that every one of their students are on track to graduate on time and meeting all the graduation requirements. They give us that report. We take that report to the school. We meet with the guidance counselor and we talk about that, and we pull some files on some of our students to make sure that they are where they need to be. Then in closing, very, very, very excited and fortunate to have received the CSP grant, and it's an NC Access grant, is what we're calling it. And because of that grant, I know we're going to start seeing more and more charter schools that are becoming more and more diverse. We've had several conversations with some of our high quality charter schools, asking them to think about either expanding or replicating, so we can have more access to these students. And then we're having a lot of conversations with schools that are in their planning year or their first 3 years, asking about this grant. And Epicenter is something that we've just instituted. The General Assembly funded this for our office, and it's a web-based document management platform, and it will house the entire life cycle of a charter school, from application to ready to open, to renewals, performance framework, risk assessment, amendments, everything, even closure. So it'll make it more efficient for us to be able to monitor and support our schools. That is a very quick overview of the report that you have in front of you, that we will be asking you to vote on next month, and we'll be submitting it to the General Assembly.
Questions? Mr. Duncan?
Are the comparisons with the traditional public schools that were shown on several of the charts required by the General Assembly report?
Part of the, yes.
Okay.
They want to know how we're comparing to traditional schools. That's the way we're showing it.
In order to have an apples-to-apples comparison, would you not agree with me statistically you would need to be showing what the various subgroups were composed of? For example, you indicated the percentage of students of color for charter schools was a little over 30%. What is the comparison for a subgroup of the students of color, for example, in traditional public schools? I didn't see English as a second language on there. In order to get a better sense of the data in terms of what we're looking at, we're making comparisons, don't we? Have to break it out, and perhaps even break it out by district, since a number of our districts don't have a charter school. So the comparisons would be more truly versus the schools in the county where they might be, and then a breakdown again with the demographics. So I feel like if we're going to give a report, we ought to do it right, which would be a report that provides the kind of information you're providing, but also does it in a way that we're looking at the same thing. We're not making a comparison of unequal things.
That chart right there does show what the subgroups comparison are, and obviously it is across the state. We're not comparing Mecklenburg County to Mecklenburg County charter schools to traditionals, but that is the subgroups.
But that doesn't tell me what the percentages are.
Percentage of students?
Yes, sir.
I believe it is in our report. It'll give you the percentage of students in each one of our subgroups.
And what about versus the state subgroups, to try to break that out so you can start to break out and look at a true comparison? I do think that'd be, if we're going to try to give that kind of information, if there's a reason the General Assembly wants that, then I think it's important that we do a report that provides the information in a way that more accurately compares, if you will, apples to apples, as best one can do. As Dr. Zhang used to say, Fiji's to Fiji's, I believe he used to say. Anyway, that does catch my eye, and I think it would be helpful if we could get that broken out.
Yes, ma'am.
That comment, additional questions, Ms. Kamnitz?
This may be the same thing that Mr. Duncan's saying, but I'm looking at that particular graph. So my question that pops into my head is, for example, just looking all the way at the end, students with disabilities, what are the real numbers that are associated with those two bars? So are we comparing thousands of students with disabilities in LEAs versus a much smaller number in charters? I'd like to get an idea of the relative size of those groups, which I think is what.
It's a great point, and obviously, we only have 109,000 students, and
Right.
out of those, I can get you what the number of
Or
our
proportion, or what, something that gets to that feeling. It's,
Okay.
yeah.
Dr. Oxendine?
Thank you so much for this report. You always do a great job each year when you bring it to the state board. I'm very impressed with the way the Charter School Initiative holds low-performing schools accountable. And I would imagine that that's a mammoth undertaking. Walk through the process. Does it take an hour to interview a school, or paint a scenario of that?
Okay, once we get the list of low-performing schools, then our office works with the Charter School Advisory Board, and we try to schedule those schools to come in and for either 2 consecutive months, maybe 3 consecutive months. We don't like to, because they're also vetting applications, things like that. So they get about a 30-minute interview. Like they have 5-10 minutes to do a presentation, and then the CSAB will ask them questions and give them charges, instructions. And then after that, we will schedule what we call a risk assessment visit to those schools. And that is a one-day visit where one of our consultants will go to the school, meet with the administration, observe every single class, do a closing exit interview with the leadership, come back in a week or so. We'll provide them with a report that the things that we noticed, the things we saw, resources that they could have to improve, and we send it to the school. And then we have what we call low-performing training camps for our low-performing schools, where our high-quality charter schools will host one of these low-performing training camps. Our low-performing schools in that area will come. The school will do an all-day professional development. They will discuss different implementations, how to implement their curriculum, and then they'll go in the classroom and see it done. And at the end of the day, they'll come home. The schools that we have done that have hosted that so far, Henderson Collegiate, KIPP, Halifax, Sugar Creek, Community School Davison, and there's one other school I can't think. So we do that. And then again, we have what we call regional huddles, where we have professional development during the summer at two schools in different areas, and we have professional development for that too. We bring in DPI people, charter school, our office, and then charter school leaders will put on professional development all day. And then we have our annual Leadership Institute in October. That's a 2-day conference where we do the same thing.
Very thorough. I would imagine that those are some strategies that would be applicable to all schools. I love the huddle idea.
Yeah.
Very good, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so board members, this is before us for discussion this month. The full report is also posted on eBoard. If you want to take the time to go through that and direct any questions to Mr. Machado and his team, feel free to do so. Great. How about let's move to EIC S6, Hope Charter, and PAVE SE Riley's request to adopt an articulation agreement.
Okay, minor, Madam Chair, that I'm recused from this.
Thank you for that notification.
Hope Charter School is a charter school here in Raleigh that has been low performing for quite some time. 2 years ago, they did get up to be a C, dropped right back down to an F. Very small school, has about 120 students. Their board, who I would characterize as one of the strongest boards we have in the state, just came to me probably close to a year ago with this idea that they're up for renewal this year, that they're just gonna voluntarily relinquish their charter because they feel like they just can't get it done in their model. So they talked about different possibilities, and then they started talking to PAVE Southeast Raleigh, who has a lot of the same demographics. They serve in the same area of Raleigh. So they decided, both their boards met, decided to have an articulation agreement where when Hope closes, which will be at the end of the year, when their students will get enrollment preference to go into PAVE. They won't be guaranteed a spot, but if they're openings, they will get preference to those spots. And the staff at Hope will also get first interviews for any jobs open. Not guaranteeing them a job, not guaranteeing the students a spot, but giving them preference. And I think that speaks very highly of Hope Charter Schools Board to try to help get those students into schools other than theirs when they're closing. So I was very pleased with that. So that's what we're asking you to vote on next month.
Questions, comments? Okay, great, that'll be before us for action next month. Moving on to EICS 7, charter school enrollment growth requests for our approval. Growth requests,
Okay.
more than what they anticipated.
Right. Statute says that a charter school can grow up to 30% without state board approval. There are 4 schools that are before you right now want to increase larger than the 30%. One is Northeast Academy of Aerospace. They're in Elizabeth City. They opened in 2015. They're asking to increase by 37.6%. That's going from 567 to 600. They serve 7th through 12th grade, and they are currently a C school. Montessori, Montessori is in its first year. They're in Southern Pines. They want to increase 46%, which is 113 to 127, and they're currently K2, and they are approved to be K6, and they will add 1 grade per year. Cross Creek Charter is in Lewisburg. They were their first year of existence was 2010. They want to increase 43.4%. That's from 326 students to 360. They are K8, and they are a C school in Met Growth. STARS is in Voss. They were chartered in 2010. They want to increase 40%, 697 to 750. They are K11. They're B school and they Met Growth. Okay, and the last school that's before you is Oxford Prep. They are currently a 612 school in Oxford. They're asking for an enrollment that they don't want to take place until in 2020, when they will be a K5 school. They'll be a K12 when everything is finished. So they're increasing 63%, which is adding 330 students. But those students are coming from K through 5. Okay, they're a B school in Met Growth. Oxford Prep is a very high-performing school in Oxford, North Carolina. So those are the 5 requests for enrollment increases.
And I believe Oxford Prep is asking for the enrollment approval from us this month because of a facility negotiation.
Yes, thank you, Ms. White. That's exactly right. They're in the process of getting a loan and building a building to house these extra students, and they want to do it. They want to start that process next year.
Questions about those schools? Excellent. Moving right along, we have the last item on the agenda today for us is EICS 8, Queens Grant Community School and Matthews Charter Academy request to adopt an articulation agreement.
Right. Matthews Charter School is a K-8 school in the obviously the Matthews area of Mecklenburg County, and Queens Grant is about 5-6 miles away. That is a K-12 school. So their Matthews Charter School is asking for our articulation agreement for their 8th graders to get enrollment preference to go into Queens Grant High School, which you've granted several of those in the past.
Any questions? Wonderful. Thank you very much for sticking with us and especially letting us have that lunch period. Mr. Davis. And,
Thank you, Ms. White. We'll now move to the Educator Standards and Practice Committee. Dr. Oxendine.
Thank you, Chairman Davis. I am Olivia Oxendine. I chair this committee. Joining me in that responsibility is Ms. Amy White. On ES&P agenda for this month, we have 3 items. One item is the action on first reading. Will be presented by Dr. Tomberlin, and it is with regard to the teacher compensation models for advanced teaching roles, and that is going to be coming to us tomorrow for a vote. So I would like to call Dr. Tomberlin or Dr. Petrie Martin or Dr.
Any doctor.
Dr. not Olivia
You're a
Oxendine.
doctor in the house.
got it too, JV.
Going once, going twice. What I will say about this item is that it's in your, board members, it is in your material, the background on this item. It stems from legislation. There was we did provide an extension to review the applications for this model due to some inclement weather this past fall. So we promised that we would bring this item to you today, and I'm bringing my preliminary preamble notes to an end as the speaker takes over. Good afternoon,
Good
Dr.
afternoon.
Tomberlin.
Sorry I stepped out for a minute. It was inopportune time.
I'll keep you after school.
Okay. So I would like to present to the board today our recommendations for 4 grant awards for the teacher compensation models and advanced teaching roles RFPs, and briefly give you some context of the provisions of this grant, and then to make our recommendations. So this program was started back in 2016 with an RFP for 5 LEAs. Well, actually, there was we had about 10 spots that we could give out, and 5 of those were dedicated to school districts with ADMs of 4,000 or less. And only 1 school at that time in that category applied for a grant, which was Washington County, and they received it. So in Session Law 2018-5, the legislature authorized us to renew the RFP process and allow those small districts with ADMs of less than 4,000 to reapply and to allocate those 4 remaining slots. And so that's what we are coming to you with today. Across the state, there are 40 LEAs that meet that requirement, that size requirement, and these are the 13 that applied for the grant. All their proposals are posted online on the District Human Resources website. And as part of this process, we will be providing all the grantees with feedback from the reviewers on their proposals. So all the 13 will receive feedback on the rubric and the relative weaknesses and strengths of their proposals, regardless of whether they were selected or not. So some of the goals of the RFP, of the grant proposal or the pilot, is to define highly effective educators. So part of the proposal that the LEA submitted was to determine what they considered to be highly effective teachers. It did not have to follow the state's definition, but they could certainly incorporate that into their process. They had to indicate the indicators and a message of how they would organize their classes to support an advanced teacher or a lead teacher role, and then how that lead teacher would be leveraged to lead school-wide improvement programs in the school. The second purpose was to determine how differentiated salary would work in the district and how it would be awarded. So the focus of that piece of the RFP was to demonstrate how they would differentiate salary, but in a financially sustainable model. because we know these grant funds will eventually go away. We wanted to know that the districts could continue to support any kind of differentiated salary system beyond the life of the grant. The least consideration in this was given to plans that used grant funds to support that differentiated compensation system. So they could do that, but we made it clear to them that that would not be weighted as heavily as other systems that would support a sustainable model. And then the third purpose was to determine how the LEA will measure effectiveness of these advanced teaching roles. So we urge these the school districts to describe how they would measure the effectiveness of their advanced teachers both qualitatively and quantitatively. So certainly they would be able to use tools like EVOS and evaluation data, but also other things like survey of teachers, cultural, the school culture surveys, other things that they could incorporate for measuring the effectiveness of those advanced teaching roles. And we did award more points or gave more consideration to those proposals that used what we would call a mixed methods evaluation process. And then finally, the districts had to show that their programs were scalable. They could certainly select districts within the LEA, individual schools within the LEA, but if their proposals were dependent on the certain idiosyncratic structure of one school and could not be replicated across the district, then that they would not get as many points. The idea was that they could, whatever their program was, whether they started small or started district-wide, they could scale it at some point if they needed to. And of course, sustainability was again an issue. So, in the most recent round of budget bill, the legislature appointed some additional funding for this program. They awarded $200,000 of non-recurring funds to be used in this new round of RFPs. That first bullet should have a question mark after it because it is not a statement. It should be a question. Where NCDPI is wondering if those funds, those non-recurring funds, could be used to support the evaluation process of the pilot. As you know, Dr. Stallings, who presented to you earlier, and the Friday Institute are conducting the evaluation for this pilot, and we've just added on 4 new LEAs, and so is there a possibility that we could divert some of that money to the evaluation of the program, especially since the legislation also extended the program out until the 24-25 school year. So there's some questions about how long that evaluation is going to run and if we've got sufficient funding to support it. The other thing we would want to do is use that $200,000 for planning funds for the grant recipients. So that would be a one-time use of funds for get them prepared for implementing their plans in the 1920 school year. So there are $500,000 in recurring funds. On average, that would be $125,000 per year for each of the 4 LEAs that we're recommending. So there's not a requirement that it be divided equally. We will look at their budget proposals and see what makes sense, and we will make recommendations to the board on how we would apportion those funds based on their budget proposals. I am trying to go through this very quickly because I know time is an issue, so if you have any questions, please feel free to stop me. So the use of the grant funds, this is just from the legislation, the variety of ways that they can use these funds to support advanced teaching roles. And then these are the requirements of the evaluation of the pilot. So this is all information that we've presented to you before. So unless anyone has a specific question, I just offer it there for your edification. Also in the grant is flexibility on class size. LEAs who receive these grants they may exceed the maximum class size requirements for grades K-3. And then the timeline for the grant, Planning is this school year, the 2018-19 school year. Implementation will begin for these 4 districts in 19-20 school year, and it concludes with the other grant recipients in the at the end of the 24-25 school year. So before I go to the questions of the starting budget, I would like to share with you the 4 school districts that we are recommending that the board fund under this grant proposal. These districts are, before I announce them, I want to say we had 9 independent reviewers. They gave a numerical grade on each of the aspects of the rubric. For each aspect of the rubric, we tossed out the highest and the lowest score, so, to account for any bias that there might be that we not know about, that somebody might have a connection or a grudge. And then we selected the top 4 point getters. And those LEAs are Bertie County Schools, Halifax County Schools, Hertford County Schools, and Lexington City Schools. And so if the board would like further information on the scoring or the scoring of the rubrics, we're happy to share that with you. But those are our recommended LEAs for the grant for funding. So the last question I have for the board in regard to this is how to use the $200,000 in non-recurring funds. So what we would propose is that we allocate the $200,000 evenly between the 4 districts to get them started for planning purposes for the 19-20 school year. And then as we review all the budgets for these 4 recipients, we will come back to you in February with a recommendation for how to allocate the recurring funds according to their budget proposals.
Okay, very good. Any questions or comments? At some point, Dr. Tomberlin, after implementation begins, I have a personal interest in knowing just how these advancement roles, what do they look like? What are the teachers doing differently? You know, what makes the role creative, and how we can learn, how the board can learn from the creativity and the innovation, because I would hope that at some point we will learn enough from this initiative to begin thinking about and proposing to the General Assembly what can we do with teacher salaries, educator salaries, and maybe this pilot and this further initiative will inform some of those discussions. So if we could hear from some of the models in the future would be great. Superintendent Johnson.
Thank you. I'm just wanted to make a comment that I'm excited to see that 3 of these districts are in the East. I think that is a great thing for the East, that these districts stepped up with very strong applications, because especially our rural districts in the East, really a place where we need to focus on growing our own recruits, but then also training leaders in the schools. And I'm really excited to see that they stepped up.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I didn't mean to always look in this direction. I'm glad you got my attention to look that way. Any other questions or comments?
This process has, our future iterations or application processes going forward, right? There will be another round.
That would be up to the legislature. So
assuming there's appropriations,
are
we asking for that?
I think we are. That would be a better question for either the superintendents or the board's legislative liaisons. But my sense is that everyone is very well disposed towards this grant process, and I was particularly encouraged to see how many of these small LEAs, who generally don't have the capacity to do grant applications, how many of them did attempt at it this time. And I think there's a lot of interest on the part of the LEAs that this program continue and that other opportunities become available. So whatever we can do to communicate back to the General Assembly that LEAs are, they are positively disposed towards this kind of grant opportunity and innovation work. I think that's the feedback that I've gotten.
There are some applicants here that, I'll speak, superintendent spoke up for the east, I'll speak up for the west a little bit. I do get it, but those applicants that, I assume there's going to be a debriefing for those applicants who did not get, were not on the list.
Yes, so we, so the
I will talk to your
recipients.
sister, Tom. That's-
Well, I did have a conversation with my old school chum, Will Hoffman, and he was okay. And so, and they had a particularly good application.
I also want to just say I do agree with your comment around about these applicants stepping forward, particularly on the sustainability piece that you mentioned earlier. Because some of these schools, the tax base and other issues around that application process would be, the sustainability would be a challenge. And I'm delighted you're doing that.
So one of the things that I think is that LEAs are recognizing that wasn't apparent in the first round of this is not about taking grant money and supplementing pay for teachers in a time-limited fashion. This is really about working to change the organization of the school, the infrastructure of the school that would support something like that. And I think as we think about that, LEAs are much more positively disposed to entering in that kind of situation than can I get teachers a few extra bucks for a couple of years.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Fine, those are good comments and questions. Other commentary or questions on this item? It will be coming I will bring it to the board tomorrow for a vote. So thank you, Dr. Tomberlin. The next item is a discussion item, the potential policy implications for LICN 003. This is the topic that we have been discussing since the summer, since August, on making a policy decision around changing from the Pearson licensure math test to, I think the vendor would be ETS, and the heavy lifting in terms of the research and the deliberation and conversation has rested with Pepsi and a subcommittee of Pepsi. I think it's called the Math Expert Committee. And so we are not quite ready to make a decision on a policy, on a change in policy. We will be discussing this particular issue for at least 1 or 2 additional board meetings before we're ready to do that. Presenting today, and he is ready to go at the mic, and this is Dr. Bastian. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
It is, thank you.
And I will welcome to the State Board of Education meeting, and I will turn it over to you to take us further.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. My name is Kevin Baston. This is work I did with a colleague who's now at Georgia Southern, Christina Patterson. We're at the Education Policy Initiative at Carolina, or EPIC, at UNC Chapel Hill. I want to acknowledge, actually, before even really jumping in this, the UNC system. They funded this work, and it's really part of their ongoing investments in educator preparation and research and educator effectiveness. So today I want to discuss the Pearson licensure exams. It's a suite of 3 exams. I'll talk a little about them in a little bit more detail, and the extent to which they're predicting the performance of early career teachers. So just as a quick overview, I'll give a little bit of background on the 3 licensure exams, and then jump right into talking about the research we conducted, what our sample was, what outcomes we're looking at it for teachers, how we're looking at the Pearson licensure exams, how we use them for analyses, a little bit of descriptive data on those who are passing versus failing the exams on their first attempt, and then we'll look at EVOS and evaluation rating results, and wrap up with just sort of a summary of, again, of what we found and some broader discussion points. Feel free at any point to ask clarifying or any other questions as well, so feel free to just jump right in. All right, just to get on the same page, so to speak, this is these Pearson licensure exams we're going to talk about. It's a suite of 3 licensure exams for elementary and exceptional children general curriculum licensure areas. The first, Foundations of Reading, is assessing teachers or candidates' knowledge of reading development, comprehension, instruction, and assessment. And of course, you might imagine that a teacher's score on this assessment might be related to their EVOS estimate in K through 2 reading on the M class, or in upper elementary grades EOG reading. And that's what we'll look at. The second exam, the general curriculum multi-subject exam, is at least sort of 3 parts. It's assessing a teacher's knowledge of language arts, history and social sciences, and science and technology. And of course, what that means is it's hard to necessarily relate it to performance in reading or science, because it's about more than just those subjects, for instance. And then finally, there's the mathematics exam. It's assessing teachers' knowledge of numbers and operations, functions in algebra, geometry and measurement, and statistics and probability. And of course, we might expect it to be related to a teacher's EVOS estimate in upper elementary grades mathematics on the EOG. So just a little bit of background on our research. We're going to focus on 1,121 teachers here in North Carolina. To be in our sample, we're focusing on teachers who have less than 3 years of experience in the 14-15 through 16-17 school years. And these are teachers who have scores on all 3 of these licensure exams. I've hinted at it already. We're going to look at their EVOS estimates on M class in grades K through 2. This is particularly the text reading comprehension portion of that exam. And then on EOG exams in grades 3 through 6 and math reading. And we also do look at 5th grade science. In addition to that, we'll look at evaluation ratings on each of the 5 professional teaching standards. So broadly, we're running 2 types of models, and you'll see this language used on results slides as it comes up. Screening models, basically we're asking whether those who passed one of these respective licensure exams on their first try are more effective than those who did not. So for example, did those who passed Foundations of Reading on their first attempt, do they have a higher EVOS estimate on the M class, let's say, than their peers who failed initially? To complement that, we're running what we call signaling models, which are just asking whether those with higher scores on these exams, are they more effective than those with lower scores? So do teachers who score higher on the mathematics exam have higher EVOS estimates in mathematics? All of our models, we're going to try to control for characteristics of the teacher, the students they're teaching, and the schools they're in, just to better isolate the relationships we're estimating. And before looking at our predictive validity results, I think it's worthwhile to think about just some of the descriptive characteristics. So what we're looking at here are characteristics of teachers in our sample. Again, those 1,121 teachers, those who passed a respective licensure exam, and you see the 3 across the top on their first attempt, and then those who don't. And there's a couple key takeaways, I think, from this slide. First, I can orient you to the very bottom, where it shows that roughly 3/4 of these 1,121 individuals passed Foundations of Reading on the first attempt. Almost 80% passed general curriculum multi-subject exam on the first attempt, and roughly 2/3 passed the mathematics exam on their first attempt. And I say first attempt each time because it's important to note the eventual pass rate would be higher, right? Because people can take it again and certainly pass. A few things of note: if the top panel of this table shows individual teacher characteristics, the bottom panel shows characteristics of the schools these teachers are working in. First, minority teachers are making up a larger portion of those who are failing a respective exam on their first attempt. So for instance, Foundations of Reading, minority teachers make up 9.35% of those who pass on the first attempt, but over 1/4 of those who fail on the first attempt. And you see similar numbers for the multi-subject exam and for mathematics, and this is, I think, of particular relevance given the benefits of a diverse teacher workforce. Secondly, again up in the top, we're looking at just a couple measures of teacher performance descriptively, not in the analyses, just descriptively. And a composite evaluation rating, just basically adding together teachers' 5 ratings on the 5 standards and their EVOS index. And what I take away from looking at that, and the results, I'll show this in a second, is that for the multi-subject exam and the mathematics exam, those who pass on the first time and those who fail on the first attempt, their values for those 2 measures of teacher performance are really quite comparable, but there are some differences for foundations of reading, and we'll see that in a second again when we look at this more rigorously. Lastly, at the bottom, we're showing school characteristics, and you see some evidence of some differences, some slight differences in school characteristics. Those who are failing one of these exams on their first attempt relative to their peers who passed tend to work in schools with slightly higher percentages of economically disadvantaged minority students, and tend to work in slightly lower performing schools, whether that's based on a performance composite, a performance grade, or whether the school is low performing. All right, so what we're looking at here is our first value-added set of results. The outcome is teachers' EVOS estimate from the K2 reading exam. At the top, the red bars are results from those screening models, so whether those who pass on their first attempt are more effective than those who don't. And so what we see at the top is those who pass the foundations of reading exam on their first attempt have EVOS estimates from the K2 M-class exam 21% of a standard deviation higher. It's statistically significant than their peers who initially failed that exam. To put that into any meaningful context for you, the difference between a first and second year teacher in foundations of reading is about 15% of a standard deviation, which means that result is slightly larger than the difference between a first and second year teacher, which trying to benchmark the fact that there's often the most growth in teacher performance early in that career period. The result for foundations reading, the signal analyses, just whether higher scores predict higher scores in the foundations reading exam predict higher EVOS estimates. It's not significant. That blue bar, there's no asterisk or bolding there. But in a slightly different model, where we control for scores on both of these exams on the left, it is positive and significant. So the point I'm trying to convey is there is some positive relationship there between foundations of reading and K2 reading. There's no significant results at all for the multi-subject exam. Again, only about a third of it is language arts based anyway. So now we're moving up a few grades. We're looking at teachers' EVOS estimates still in reading, but now from the EOG in grades 3 through 6. And here, for neither foundations of reading nor the multi-subject exam, and again, neither our screening nor signaling analyses, are there any significant results, positive or negative. Again, the direction of the results is still slightly positive for foundations of reading and negative but insignificant for the multi-subject, but no statistically significant results. Then in mathematics, I'm looking at grades 4 through 6 now for math EVOS estimates for teachers. And there, again, is no statistically significant relationship between performance on the general curriculum mathematics exam and then how those early career teachers go on to perform based on EVOS in math. It's not a particularly large sample, and I can talk about this a little bit more. It's a little bit more than 300 teachers, but the estimates are also quite small as well. It's not as if it's a small sample and large estimates, and it just wasn't significant because it was a small sample. They're small results. So this shifts now from EVOS to the 5 professional teaching standards and evaluation ratings. So of course, while EVOS is subject area specific, evaluation ratings are not. So we treat how we look at the tests a little bit differently. The red bars now are screening analyses, are now looking at whether teachers who pass all 3 exams on the first attempt receive higher evaluation ratings than their peers who fail at least one of the 3. The blue bars, the signaling models, are just asking whether the average of all 3 scores the first time they take it predicts higher evaluation ratings. And here you do see certainly many more positive results across all 5 teaching standards. You can see that those who pass all 3 exams on the first attempt are receiving higher ratings. So for example, those who pass all 3 exams on their first attempt, they have ratings on facilitating student learning, about 12% of a standard deviation higher than a fellow peer who failed at least one of the 3. Again, to give you some idea of what 12% of a standard deviation would be in the evaluation ratings. The difference between a first and second year teacher in evaluation ratings is roughly about 1/3 of a standard deviation. So it's, whereas the value added results earlier were actually a little bit larger than that difference between a first and second year teacher, this is smaller, about a third of that difference then. For 4 of the 5 teaching standards, we also see positive and significant results for the signaling analyses. So for instance, the average of all 3 scores predicts evaluation ratings 8% of a standard deviation higher in the leadership standard. We dug a little bit deeper to see whether any of the particular 3 licensure exams perhaps were carrying a little bit more weight in explaining the positive results we saw in the previous slide. And there's some evidence here to suggest that Foundations of Reading was doing so. So for 3 of the 5 standards, higher scores on Foundations of Reading is related to higher evaluation ratings.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
just a quick clarification question for Dr. Bastian. I understand Foundations of Reading because if I remember your description of the exam, it includes instruction, so pedagogy.
It's focused on, it's really pretty well aligned with, what this 5 scientifically based reading instruction are. That's a key portion of the test, yeah.
So, but on the general curriculum multi-subject, but especially the general curriculum mathematics, why would we expect a content exam to have positive returns to leadership, classroom environment, facilitating learning, and reflecting on practice?
I mean, I think that's a fair question for any of them, even the Foundations of Reading. I mean, I think what I would say is you might expect teachers who are scoring higher on any given content exam to hypothetically, and you could argue the other way, but hypothetically have certain knowledge, skills, or dispositions that are going to make them be rated more effective by their principal.
I had a really good calculus teacher at Chapel Hill. Actually, I was a terrible student, but she was a terrible teacher. She was really good at calculus.
Well, I mean, I think it gets to what I hear you asking, though,
she wasn't very good at teaching calculus.
What I also hear you asking is a slightly larger question that I think is a normative question about where someone might want to put their weight of these results.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand why we are thinking about the content knowledge.
Right. Well, I mean, there's multiple reasons I think to focus on evaluation ratings too. It's capturing other dimensions of teaching performance or teaching quality that I think are valuable. A teacher's skill is not wrapped up in a value-added estimate only. It's a multimodal type thing. This gets at it in a slightly different way, and it should give us different lenses at that. I mean, different competencies. And it's not really true for elementary grades because almost every elementary teacher now that we have K2 has an EVOS or a value-added estimate. But in a lot of states and a lot of places, almost everybody has a valuation rating, but a much smaller sample of teachers has a value-added estimate, so it gets you a bigger sample too. It's less so here.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments while we're questioning and commenting? Mr. May. You may proceed.
Thank you. I had a pretty good calculus teacher.
I can tell.
I want to say that I want to start. I'm going to sort of wrap up by talking about what very specifically these results say, and then a broader, more implications discussion. I want to start that with sort of noting the limitation that these are early analyses, and it's a relatively small sample, 1,121. I regularly do quantitative research where it's many, many thousands more. So it's an early analysis. I just want to note that. Results certainly indicate that Foundations of Reading scores predict higher EVOS estimates in K2 reading. not for 3 to 6 reading. People who know much more about what's on this exam, the foundations of reading, that doesn't necessarily surprise them given the content it's assessing. The general curriculum multi-subject exam is unrelated to EVOS estimates in K2 reading and for the reading EOG. Perhaps this isn't surprising given the fact that the multi-subject exam is trying to measure a lot of things, right? English, science, and sort of social studies. Perhaps most relevant and what I think gets the most attention given what's the conversation that's gone on in the state, the mathematics exam is unrelated to EVOS estimates in mathematics in grades 4 through 6. But again, results are more positive and robust for the evaluation ratings, and particularly for foundations of reading. So this wasn't, I gave this presentation last month to Pepsi. This slide wasn't there then, everything else was, but this really bubbled up in the discussion with commission members then, and so I wanted to sort of explicitly put it here now. So just a few last points, and then certainly happy to take more questions. First, I think this is obviously perhaps go without saying, but it seems states have an important responsibility to ensure the quality of its teacher workforce, and one way, of course, of doing that are licensure exams that set at least a minimum threshold of what teachers should be able to know. When you start to think about licensure exams and the use of them for high-stakes decisions, it seems to me there's a few important criteria to consider. We've only looked at one of them. That's the last one, predictive validity. Does the exam then scores, do they go on to predict the performance of early career teachers? If they do, I think that says something about using the exam to make high-stakes decisions. If they don't, I think that introduces important questions. But there are other important criteria, including reliability. So is the exam accurately sort of measuring the teacher's knowledge? And alignment with content to be taught. Is the exam, measuring things that the teacher is actually teaching to those students, or the teacher should know? Third, important highlight, it was a very palpable portion of the presentation last month, this idea of teacher shortages and whether, how licensure exams may contribute to those. And and they can. I don't want to dismiss that. But I think it's worth noting, and we've seen this in North Carolina, in other places across the United States, shortages can be cyclical, and they can be addressed in a myriad of ways, not just getting rid of an exam, for instance. And I think this also goes without saying, and it's related to certainly what I believe Pepsi has recommended, is these are 3 distinct exams, and of course that means they can sort of be treated by officials such as you distinctly. Doesn't keeping one does not mean keeping 3 does not mean keeping all of them. They can be pieced and done essentially. So with that, happy to take any further questions.
Are there any questions or comments?
Question, timetable on the policy changes. Chair, I think you said we weren't ready for this month. It's going to be for some. It gets back to your teacher shortage bullet there. For some schools, some teachers, some principals, some superintendents, this is very time sensitive and urgent. The clock is ticking, and while I'm delighted to have this research, anecdotally, what I am hearing on the phone from several who have called saying I am losing really good teachers. And one quote was, tested in an area that they will not teach, nor have our public universities taught it. And it was particularly, in this case, calculus. And so I just want to make sure that as we're trying to transition, that we also understand that out there in the field there are some waiting on an answer, and I'm not suggesting that we do away with send a signal to our LEAs that we're transitioning and how to handle those that are in that classroom right now.
I appreciate your,
I see Tom moving.
I just want to see if either of them wanted to comment.
I'm with you on the urgency 100%. And it isn't to say that we won't have a policy change. We probably need just a little bit more information before we
And something to
step
transition
into
to.
something
Yeah,
that we may regret. Or see that, Dr. Petrie-Martin.
And so that is correct. Actually, there have been discussions on policy recommendations. We've decided to take another month to dig into those, get additional feedback, and then bring it back to the table. But those have already started.
And I don't think our Moorhead Scholar, J.B. Buxton, should be the test of whether you could get calculus or not.
Yeah, I didn't get calculus at all. Just a couple questions that maybe
Yes, Mr. Buxton.
to add into the discussion. First, it's not about Dr. Bastian's presentation, and I find this research compelling and thoughtful, and appreciate your explaining some of the differences in the standard. You should teach calculus again.
If I could pass the exam.
So my question is that we can, for next month, would be a couple things. One is, and really, I don't think any of these are for you, do we have research like this on the praxis exam that that has been put on the table? So if we're gonna be,
I'm just gonna let Dr. Bastian
Yes.
off the hook.
so
And
that
I'll-
would be,
I'll-
and these don't necessarily need to be answered, they're just questions I'll have as we continue.
Sure.
One is that. The second is, what other states are using the test we're talking about getting rid of? I was not on the board, and I think some of my colleagues weren't as well, when this first surfaced. So the best I can tell, we had a really low passage rate, and we're trying to figure out how to deal with that. Are other states grappling with the same passage rate? All I know is that Massachusetts uses it, and I can't imagine that our teacher candidates are any less able to do this math than the Massachusetts teacher candidates, so why have they not abandoned it, and why are we talking about abandoning it?
I'm sorry, another question?
And then the last question is, if this test, I don't think we should hold it to a predictive standard because it's a kind of safe to practice, you've got the content knowledge. So I want to understand, if this test is not giving us what we give, why do we not do like an open bid process for the test that would give us? Because I think some of these companies customize their exams. So if we want more pedagogy in it, or we want more tailored content knowledge, couldn't we be a little bit more the captain of our own ship here rather than casting about for a test that we think might be a little bit better? I have no idea about what's on each test, so I don't really care what test we have as long as it's what we want. And this just feels a little bit like we got low passage rates and we need to abandon ship.
So may I respond to some of those questions?
You
Just
may.
so everybody understands some critical points to all of this. One, you referenced the pass rates in the practice. I'm assuming you mean the Pearson, the elementary.
On
Most of-
Praxis, I said, do we have the same data that Kevin just presented on
On
Praxis?
praxis. We do not, because most of this conversation has been about elementary and the Pearson tests. As far as the pass rates go, in other presentations on that very subject, I've tried to make it clear, and we're trying to get definitive numbers on a lot of our perceptions of the pass rate are based on the fact that we've now allowed teachers to wait 2 years after completing their program to take the test or to pass the test. So the problem is it used to be everybody took the test over and over and over their last year of college so they could get licensed and get a job. Now, you're taking it one time, your last year of college, you're going out and getting the job, and then by somewhere around the end of your second year of teaching, all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, I got to pass this test. And so that's a difference, and that's going to have huge impact on the pass rates. So we're working to make sure we're to bring you information on what the pass rate is for the Pearson, the true pass rate measured by the cohort. Everybody who entered the profession in the 2014-15 school year, and of all those elementary people who entered, what percentage of them ultimately passed the test? Now, I think we're going to be surprised at what the reality of the situation is, and I think what we're going to find is the pass rate's not any worse, What's worse is that we've got the 20% of teachers who never made it into the profession have now made it into the profession. And districts are looking at those 20% that can't pass the test, nor would they have passed the test to begin with, and saying, we're going to have to let them go, but wait a minute, they're great teachers. And that's the problem we're experiencing, because before they never would have met them. And so that's what we're trying to decide. But I think you're hitting on a question that's at the heart of this, of all this. What is the licensure exam supposed to do? Because what I'm hearing is a discussion about the difference between competency, I know you know what you need to know to do the job, and effectiveness, how well you take that knowledge and apply it. It's a very valid question to ask. Can a licensure exam tell us whether somebody's going to apply their knowledge in an effective way? And I would say the answer to the question is no. So we have to decide, what are we really measuring with that test? And I agree with you. Once we get that, then we should know what the right way to go is in using the exam and pitching it at the right level.
So, Madam Chair, my only concern with this is process. It's not the test and which one we choose. It's the process by which we're identifying which licensure exam. If we need to figure out relief for 20% of teachers because we've got shortage issues, there's probably a different policy process.
Well, your concerns are my concerns, and that is one of the reasons, the major reason, that my opening statement, we're not quite there yet. We will get there, but we're not quite there. Personally, I would like to, and I've passed this on to the department, and I think the department is already acting on this. I would really like to hear the voice of our deans of our EPPs.
Good comment.
And even though the voice of Pepsi is incredibly important, I would like to hear from the deans, and I would like to hear, for a couple of reasons. I would like to know what's going on in our EPPs to prepare the students, the candidates for this licensure, the Pearson Math Licensure, the subtest. Strategies in place, new courses being offered, courses being revisited, courses being eliminated. So I think hearing the voice of our EPP deans will answer some of the questions we've asked, like what's going on to prepare students for the test, candidates for the test. And then to hear them say, yes, State Board of Education, we need to consider a policy change, not a policy change, but a change in the exam that we're proposing in policy. So the department is working on gathering that information and coming up with a mechanism to hear from the deans. We will get there, but going to your point about process, we're slowing down the process a bit. Any other comments or questions?
I support that, Madam Chair. I think that if our teachers are going to be expected, even if it's 2 years later, expected to pass that, they'll be taught and again, mine's anecdotal, but what they're saying is, I've never ever been taught that, and now I'm expected to pass the test, and we'll never teach it in my classroom because, I'm teaching the first grade and I'm expected to know calculus.
And because I don't know enough about the content of the ETS, the Praxis ETS, we may find ourselves we may change the test, the decision to go to a new test. And in 2 years, we may be back at the same table having the same discussion.
I won't be.
I'll be very near that point.
Didn't you say that 2
Yes,
years
you
ago?
will. You'll be here forever.
Didn't
You said that 8 years ago.
So we need to learn a bit more about ETS Praxis and what is measured there. Any other comments or questions? Thank you very much. And the last item is, and Dr. Tomberlin, this may involve you as well. So EPS 3 is the SB amendment to the general licensure requirement. This is a discussion item, and I think this is around the whole notion of reciprocity.
That is correct, yes.
So take it away, Dr. Tomberlin.
Thank you. So we are bringing to the board recommendations from the PEPC on LICN 001, general licensure requirements. These largely, there's some incidental changes we wanted to make, but largely this is connected to the issue of out-of-state teachers or reciprocity. So these revisions were made by the Pepsi Licensure Subcommittee. Chair of this subcommittee is Glenda Jones from Cabarrus County, and Dr. Hank Weddington. I know where he's from, but I just can't think of it right now. My apologies, Dr. Weddington. We discussed these with the Teacher Recruitment, Credentialing, and Retention Task Force, which is a group of superintendents and HR directors from each region of the state. We've presented this at the statewide PANC, and this has been approved and presented by Pepsi for the State Board of Education. The first item is listing licensure areas. The LEAs requested that in this general requirement policy that we list we connect back to LICN 001, so this is just a link in that policy. This is not a substantive change, but we're just making you aware. LICN 001 1.2, for educators whose licenses expire on or after June 30th, 2019, sorry about that, proficient shall be defined as achieving a rate of proficient or higher on all 5 of the standards of the North Carolina evaluation system. That is the current reading of that. This was changed a couple of months ago to from 3 back to 5, and I think from feedback in the field, Pepsi has asked that we return this to the original requirement that you have 3 of 5 of the standards proficient to be considered proficient, with standard 4 being one of those. If you're on an abbreviated cycle, then one of them, standard 4, has to be proficient in order for you to be deemed proficient. Of course, this goes to the importance of this designation of proficiency is teachers must be proficient in order to renew their license, their continuing license. They also must be considered proficient in order to be a mentor. They must be considered proficient to be a cooperating teacher for a student teacher. So this particular definition has lots of applications across policy, and so we wanted to make sure that we have the right one that works for the LEAs, and this is the recommendation. We will change, we are bringing this to you, this definition to you under LICN 001, but we intend to replace the definition in all other policies where it is listed, and one of them being TCED 16. So we didn't bring you TCED 16, we just brought you the change, and we'll apply it everywhere where it's applicable. Any questions on that before I move to the reciprocity?
I probably have missed it somewhere, but remind me of why does it have anything to do with mentor availability, the reason we shifted back to 3.5?
Yes, so originally there was a request that we make it all 5, and that be consistently applied across the board. But I think when the realization that would in fact mean that there were some schools out in the state that would have no proficient teachers, we realized that we had to go back to the 3 of 5 in order for them to have adequate mentors and cooperating teachers in those schools.
That is for proficient, though.
That is proficient.
Distinguished would be 5 of 5?
So, well, there's no definition of distinguished. It's not a trigger in statute or policy anywhere, so we don't define it that way. Mm-hmm. All the laws related to mentor teacher and cooperating teachers are built off the proficiency definition. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so that's the only one we've defined. We haven't had to define other ones before.
Very good.
So the next, so for the rest of, for the out-of-state teachers that are coming to North Carolina, the recommendation is that we make our process of granting licensure more liberal for those and not hold them all to our North Carolina's testing requirement. Now, everything we're talking about today is scheduled to take effect June 30th, 2019. But this is for discussion, and there has been communication from the field that the intention was to move this forward as quickly as possible. So we can certainly make that change when we bring it back to you for action next month. The way we approach this, we have a section 121A, which is the current policy regarding out-of-state teachers. And we've just added an LICN 1.21B, which contains the new process so that everyone can see what we're currently under and then what's coming up. And so that's the reason for the separation of the two. The first thing we deal with is teachers with 3 or more years of experience. In this case, we're saying that out-of-state applicants who have taken a licensure exam in a state that meets the partial requirements for licensure in that state, we will accept that exam for the purposes of North Carolina licensure. Now that means that they have to hold a license from another state, they have to have passed the exam in that state, and the score that they have has to be the passing score at the time they took it. And if they have those things and they apply for a North Carolina license, we will grant them a North Carolina license without further testing. If they have 3 or more years of experience. If they are fully licensed in another state and they have 3 or more years of experience, we will grant them a continuing professional license in North Carolina. And then these are teachers with, this is for elementary education. Here we have, because of the law, we have to get specific. The test that they took in their home state, or the state where they were licensed, has to have a subtest of mathematics and reading. Now that's in statute. We couldn't work around that. So if they don't have a subtest of math and reading, if they have that and they passed it, we'll grant them a continuing license in the state of North Carolina without further testing. If they don't have, let me go on to ECGC. If this is a elementary exceptional children's license, they have to have the subtest of math, subtest of reading, and a passing score on the EC licensure exam for the state in which they were licensed. If they meet or exceed that state score and have the license, we'll grant them a continuing license in North Carolina without further testing. Any other licensure area besides elementary and ECGC, same thing. If you pass the test, you hold the license in another state, and you pass their requirement, then we'll approve you without further testing requirements.
So the out-of-state language for the classroom teacher would be the same, for North Carolina, would be the same for any other educator category?
Yes, all licenses, we have to have a comparable license.
Yeah.
So you can't come with a skydiving license from Colorado and say, I want a mathematics license in North Carolina. They have to be comparable licensure areas. But other than that, we will, if you took the test of record and passed it in another state and gained licensure, we'll recognize that in North Carolina.
So that's out of state then is becoming streamlined across all categories that are licensed.
Across all categories, yes.
Very good. Love it.
Just to clarify, with 3 or more years of experience, if a teacher comes to us without a subtest of reading and mathematics, they're licensed, they pass their test, but they don't have that subtest, we will allow them to take the Foundations of Reading and Mathematics courses. If they pass that, if they take those courses and pass the test associated with those Foundations of Reading and Mathematics courses, then we'll license them.
We're already doing that, aren't we?
Yes, that is current policy. I just wanted to reiterate that was current policy, because we're going to take that current policy and apply it to those teachers who have fewer than 3 years of experience.
Okay.
So that's where, with the next section, teachers with fewer than 3 years of experience, everything is the same as you just read. I do need to point out that we're opening up the opportunity to take the Foundations of Reading in lieu of taking the Pearson, the Pearson, if they didn't have the subtest of reading and math. And then all other licensure areas is the same. This is, it's pretty much, if you can bring us a test with a passing score, if you're licensed in another state and can demonstrate that you passed their licensure exam, then we will grant you a North Carolina license without further testing. Now, I do have to say that this is very general and very broad. It has, when we have policies that are that broad and general, they have the potential for loopholes. And so I think as we progress to the approval date of these policies or the implementation date of these policies, we need to think about what this policy means in terms of candidates in a North Carolina EPP. Do we hold them to North Carolina tests? Or if I'm if I'm in an EPP and I decide not to get licensed in North Carolina but get licensed in Mississippi, can I then take my Mississippi license and come back and turn it into a North Carolina license and circumvent the licensure process in North Carolina? So I haven't figured all that out yet. I think this is a good first step, but I just want to make sure that we're aware that this is a really big, broad policy, and when you have policies that big and broad, they tend to have lots of ways that you can use them in unintended ways.
I think it depends on what we do with that math licensure test.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Mr. McDevitt.
For context, help me, Tom. We have generally a need for about 10,000 teachers, new teachers in our classrooms each year. Is that generally correct?
So I would need my colleague Alexis Schaus to help me understand the expansion, because I can tell you how many we lose a year. We lose about between 4,000 and 5,000 that leave the state or are no longer teaching in public schools in the state. I don't know what those numbers are in terms of expansion from year to year, which you would need to add to that to understand that.
Okay, so assuming whatever that number is, somewhere close to 10, regardless. About a third of those, at this point, we get from our traditional schools of education and the clinical experience and the tests associated with that. That's about a third of them, I think.
So well, if you combine, when you say traditional, so a lateral entry.
That's another third.
Right, but they would be held to the North Carolina testing standards.
Sure, but I'm saying at this point we are about a third from our traditional schools of education, about a third through the alternative, and about a third through reciprocity.
Sure. Yes.
And so I would just say in the larger sense, if we believe that our schools of education are valuable, then we ought to support those schools of education as a state. I believe we ought to support that clinical experience in the ways that we have it, the induction process, and we ought to prepare our teachers. I know that's an entirely different subject, but I would be concerned. To me, the state of North Carolina, in many areas, we have interstate compacts. We have interstate agreements. We have coordination guidance in some areas. And those are all across the board. I'm not talking about education. To me, a reciprocal agreement is an agreement with a specific agreement with a body, in this case, a state. And reciprocity means reciprocity. You know, we've looked at each other's hand and we agree that we have even hands. And so you will accept ours, we will accept yours based on some criteria. I'm not sure I see that happening here.
So I appreciate you bringing this up. I often get a little a little bit in trouble on the semantics of the word reciprocity.
Okay.
Because I try to be very technical when I use that term, and you're raising all the issues that I raise when we use that term reciprocity. What does it mean? I would argue this is not true reciprocity,
Right.
but this is it's easy shorthand so everybody knows what we're talking about. We have no agreement with any other state that they will take our assessments as proof of proper preparation. We don't have that. Furthermore, the expectation that we've looked at everybody else's hand and their hand's the same as our hand is patently not true.
Exactly.
It is, we are making an assumption that this is that they did what they were supposed to do. And I think we tried to address this before in policy with the term comparable. The problem was we had no expertise to determine, is this really a comparable test? There's lots of ways you could approach that. We didn't have any resident, licensure certainly didn't have any resident expert to sit down and go through all the other states' tests and determine what was comparable and what wasn't. So you're right, we're making a lot of assumptions in this, and in this case, reciprocity is a misnomer, but I think it's a term that people understand and can appreciate in terms of what this means from a policy perspective.
Well, I would just, back to my original point, Madam Chair, I would hope that as a state, we could have a goal that 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 begins to change, and that my opinion is we ought to move that significantly move the number up that come in from our universities.
Our EPPs.
Yes.
Indeed, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Mr. Buxton.
Do we know, you just made thank you, Madam Chair, a couple points I want to plumb a little bit. How many states do we think that have similar tests like ours are at our standard or above when it comes to licensure?
Well, I may think there's outside of elementary, most of them. I think when we have these discussions, elementary and ECGC are always the elephant in the room. Everything else is kind of non-substantial. I mean, from what I've seen from praxis, the other content areas that we have tests in, other states have the same test and the same pass rates, because most of us are using Praxis's recommended test for a subject area and their recommended cut score. So in that regard, I think we're doing fine. For elementary, we are standing alone with Massachusetts. And we're not really standing alone with Massachusetts anymore. I've had conversations with my counterpart in Massachusetts. They've actually redone the Pearson test. They've had Pearson redo their test based on their movement and their standards. And so they're taking it's similar to what we're taking now, but they've already kind of modified it since we adopted it, and we haven't adopted it. I mean, we haven't modified our version. We just took it the way it was. So really, we're kind of standing alone out there. I would say the Massachusetts test is maybe, I mean, it's hard to say it's harder, it's different, but I would argue that objectively, the Pearson tests are probably one of the most challenging elementary licensure tests across the country.
Quick follow-up. So my question is not about the Pearson test. My question is about the policy of pegging our standard to whatever your standard is. So essentially, we now we could accept the lowest standards in the country on what it takes to become a teacher, or the highest, or the middle. But what is the point of our setting I mean, if we believe there's a cut score on a test that's important, safe to practice in North Carolina, but if you come from, you name the state, we don't care, that's a weird policy. So we're pegging ourselves to the lowest common denominator, no matter what your cut score is. And so if you have a teacher shortage in Mississippi or Massachusetts or wherever, and you drop your cut score to the bottom, we'll take that.
Yeah.
So we could have my kids' teachers in the Wake County Public Schools who went through North Carolina public or private universities, we could be holding to a different standard than the people sitting in the classroom next to them. I don't know. this is where I'm losing the thread of the logic for having a standard in North
I
Carolina.
think you said it right.
And I hear you.
I think you're right.
I mean, I'm not, let me, wait, I'm just a little concerned about what we're saying about standards for teaching. It's an important job.
Of course it is, and it's a very good point to raise, and I know I've got to move it along. I've gotten all kind of signals from the chair. And, but I'm sure the licensure experts in the building will take a very close look at tests that are coming. I mean, the applicants for license to teach in our state will, I'm sure that their applications will be thoroughly reviewed, and some decision will be made about whether or not they receive a license based on our policy, I hope. And I'm pointing to the
Yep,
superintendent.
just one quick thing.
Politely.
Just want to thank you, Dr. Tomberlin. I want to thank the professional staff in licensing. We are taking some pretty amazing strides in this area. It is not going to be easy, but we are going to do it. This is a twofold approach. One, we are going to really chip away at the waiting list that exists right now and getting teachers into North Carolina, getting new teachers their licenses. It's a waiting list that has existed for years and years and years, and sometimes we chip away at it, but it grows again. We're going to chip away at it, and then step two, and I know you've already been working on this, we're going to fix the root cause of these problems. And we are going to make it more efficient and a better process for new teachers and teachers who want to move to North Carolina to get their license in North Carolina. I thank you for your leadership in this field.
And on that note, unless we have other
Without lowering
questions.
standards, I hope. I think you mean that, but without lowering standards.
Mr. Chairman, I think this would be a pretty important issue that's going to come for decision next time. This would peg us to the lowest standards in the country.
Yeah, we've got more work to do on this item.
We sure do.
And one final question.
Yeah, just putting a reality spin on the current plight of trying to find teachers. In a school right now today, I'm sitting at my school with 3 openings right now. And I understand the standard, we should never let the standard slip, but right now we have a process where we let lateral entry teachers come in, that's only had a certain number of hours in that particular content area. I think it's something like 21 to 27 hours for a math class. I would much rather take a person that went through the educational cohort and took the classes and actually had the pedagogy to come in and then had a difficulty passing the test, and rather let somebody come in off the street with 22 hours worth of credit to go in and teach my children. So, I mean, while we do have some work to do, by all means, JB, I understand, do not lower the standards, but we do have to be realists in this deal and deal with the current crisis we have right now securing teachers. I think you quoted earlier, 4,000 teachers leave the profession each year. I know North Carolina upper echelon does not turn out 4,000 teachers to replace those that are leaving right now. So as we do have work to do, I'm definitely agreeing with that. Do not lower the standards, but please be real with what we're doing, because we need some help at the school level or get some teachers in there to teach us.
Raise pay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tomberlin, and that concludes the ES&P for January.
Thank you, Dr. Oxendine.
Raise the pay. It'll come.
We'll move to the Healthy Responsible Student Committee, and Vice Chair, Ms. Keenan, I'll call on you for that Healthy Responsible Student Committee work.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Reginald Keenan, serve Vice Chair as the Healthy Responsible Student Committee, along with Chairperson Ms. Patricia Willoughby, unable to be with us today. Mr. Chair, on the new business, we have 2 items, and the first one we have is a safety app update, and I think that'll come from Ms. Kim Martin, is my understanding.
Yeah, she's here.
Good afternoon. I apologize, I do not have a PowerPoint because there's a lot that I cannot say, and because since we are in the procurement process, and I provided a long PowerPoint at the last meeting to my attempt to give you the background on why we think student reporting anonymously is, a critical area for our state. But today, since we are in the middle of the procurement process, you received on the e-board a link to the request for proposal. so you could see the actual proposal for anonymous reporting applications that went out right before Christmas. And I wouldn't want to speak to a lot of the stuff that that proposal says in case I were to misspeak, because it's very technical and needs to be exactly what the RFP says. But we are in the middle of that process. We do, the proposals from vendors are due at the end of January. There is a timeline that was shared with you all that says all this, so I'm not saying anything that's not in the proposal again. And then in February, we will be reviewing the proposals. In March, we will be having vendor demonstrations, and then by the end of March, hope to select vendors and have a contract award, as the RFP says, by mid-April. So we are on track with that and trying to stay on schedule with that. What I did bring as a follow-up question that Tricia Willoughby had at the last meeting, I did bring a giant phone to show y'all during the pilot kind of what the application looked like, the different reporting categories that we encourage students to report into. We wanted to be clear to students what school safety was, what sort of tips we were looking for. So that's why we chose the categories of bullying, fighting, drugs, weapons, underage drinking. And the danger category was our generic category. In case a student had something different, someone broke into their car, whatever, they could still report something. They could engage the suicide prevention lifeline telephone number if they wanted to immediately talk to a trained mental health professional if it were a mental health or suicide type issue. So this is what the old application looked like and what we have tried to learn from and improve upon with this new application. I believe Mrs. Willoughby wanted to know more detail about the tips that came in during the pilot period. And just yesterday, I believe, Deanna added this handout to the e-board. And what this represents is a snapshot. When we had the application in only 40 schools, that was 2 entire school districts, Avery County and Macon County, which don't have very many schools, as you know, but it was also for Forsyth County, a selection of schools, and I believe Kinston, a selection of schools. And during that, roughly, you know, the spring semester, which would be January to May, and then the fall semester, April through Christmas, the number of tips that came in just to those 40 schools were about 132. And then adding to that the little yellow bar at the bottom, the calls that went out from the application to the suicide lifeline being 81. So that takes you up over 200 tips and calls that went in during that time period. And as you see, the majority of those were in the bullying category. Now we know that that's important to address bullying at the early level and not let it escalate, because we've heard in some of the gun violence and fighting that it's bullying that has escalated. So bullying is not to be taken lightly, but should be taken seriously. The danger category, or that generic category, we received tips that we weren't expecting through that category. Inappropriate relationships between a teacher, coach, and a student, self-harm games that middle school students were playing, those sort of things that we really didn't anticipate. So that was kind of good in a way to know that those were things that students were concerned about. Drugs was fairly high. As you might imagine, there were a couple incidents that were cleared by arrest. Taking a picture of a drug deal on the school campus resulted in an arrest in one of our pilot counties. Underage drinking, just a few. Weapons, about 7. And those, of course, are taken very seriously when you get a tip in about a weapon or even threat of a weapon being brought to school the next day. Where those little, in the little blue boxes where it says case open, suspended, needing more information, when the person at the school receives the tip, they go into the system and they designate on the drop-down bar that they've opened the case, and then anybody overseeing the application knows somebody's seen it and is working on it. And that was very important to the students because they wanted their tip to matter and somebody to do something with it and make a change at the school. Needing more information, under investigation, cleared by another person, cleared by arrest, already known about. Often, you know, certain student information was shared and people at the school know their students and might have already been aware of situations that that student was confronting. If you look to the second page, you'll see, we wanted to know, is there certain times of the day or certain days of the week when more tips came in? And it does look like the highest day in a week was Thursday that tips came in, and they did go down over the weekend, which the weekend was always and still will be a concern because you want to make sure that somebody's looking at the tips over the weekend and even in the evenings in the hopes to present something that might happen the next day or the start of the school week. And you'll also see where what time of day tips really increased. Well, in the morning from 9 to 11 was a high point, and so that tells us that some students at schools were allowed to use their phones or were using their phones one way or another and sending tips in during the school day. And then also in the evening, students get home from school, you know, they don't leave their cell phone at home. Cyberbullying may still be going on, and so they may think of things, have more time in the evening to send tips in. And it's important that we receive those tips as well. So this was the closest I could come to, I think, what Ms. Willoughby was trying to get to, actually what the volume might be of the tips. Now, one critical piece of all of this is the marketing and the way that the school pushes it out to the students and emphasizes the importance to the students. Because one of our pilot schools that was doing a really strong marketing campaign was receiving up to 40 tips a week. And that was about the highest we saw in the pilot schools, but schools were understandably concerned about how they were going to spend their time, you know, running down and investigating the tips. And it turned out to be that the volume was not that big an issue after all. The pilot, as you may know, went on from December of 2015 through the end of May 2018. And that's given us some good information, you know, to move forward with. We've also talked to a lot of stakeholders in deciding what requirements there might be for anonymous reporting. We've talked to students, we've talked to schools, talked to law enforcement, you know, what would be helpful to them in this sort of application. And it has always been our intention that this is a school tool for schools to use to get better information from those students who may not be as comfortable going to a person at the school, or fears retaliation and is afraid to go to a staff at the school, and may be more inclined to do so anonymously. Are there any other questions that I might be able to answer about the tool or application in general?
Anyone?
Yeah, Ms. Martin, thank you for this report and update. I think one question that came up at the last meeting, and I know I've received questions about it since, is apparently there is some app that other states or state might be using that is already available.
And free.
Yeah, and has no cost associated with it. Could you comment on that possibility for us?
What I can say about that is we have made that provider aware that, and that they would have to go through the RFP process in North Carolina to provide that service here statewide, and so that vendor is aware. And, you know, we don't know if they will apply or not, but they're know about it and able to do so, even if there is a cost or not a cost associated.
And to those concerns, everyone who has a concern should contact that vendor and say, please apply. Because if that vendor applies and meets all the criteria of this RFP and is selected, then we can use that money for other school safety initiatives. So we absolutely can use a free safety app if it meets the requirements set forth in statute.
Don't we have some LEAs using it now?
I believe there's one. I know one of our pilot counties, Wayne County, was going to use it, chose not to. Was using a different one, but I did hear of one, I think in the West, that has just started with it this fall. But, you know, we didn't want to assume just because it was free that it was going to meet all the requirements and the needs and, you know, safety for our children. We want to make sure we get, you know, the best application, you know, possible.
But that vendor is aware of our RFP?
Yes.
Okay. All right, thanks.
And they, I believe that particular vendor is a foundation, and so if they wanted to make a service of helping states with this issue, they might choose to apply.
Anyone else? Questions, comments?
Mr. Chair, just related, encourage the National Association of State Boards of Education, the January journal that just came to you, I hope, is about student safety and wellness. There are a lot of really good articles in there about engineering and architecture, how to, just a lot of, in some cases, minor tweaks, but a lot of things around social and economic issues, mental health, et cetera. I would just really commend reading that, because it will trigger a lot of things that our state ought to be thinking about doing in the larger picture. So I know that's not about the app, but it's directly related to school safety.
Thank you, Ms. Martin.
We do have strong connection with the state board. We have Alan Duncan on the task force for safer schools representing the state board. And we have Freebird McKinney as our teacher on the task force. So we look forward to working with them and as a way to enhance our relationship with you all as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, the last item is the Task Force on Health and Wellbeing. I think we have Ms. Erica Berry for that.
Good afternoon. I am Erica Berry, Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of the Superintendent, and I really appreciate y'all giving us a chance to come and talk about the really great work that the Superintendent's Working Group on Student Health and Wellbeing has done this year. And just for reference, we call them the Working Group because that is a very long title. So I'll be brief in terms of what we've done and just like very high level. I do want to say that online on eBoard, you should be able to find the actual report that we submitted in August. There's really great information in there, so please access that if you have not yet already. Brief overview, this group was called on by the General Assembly. It consists of 5 representatives from DPI, mostly from the EC division, 5 representatives from DHHS, 5 representatives from, 5 educators. So the most important people, 5 educators. And then 2 folks from the charter school world, and then 7 people just as stakeholders. That included academics. That also included a couple of community providers, so mental health community providers. So really great people, and they're really, really great to work with, super passionate about the work. And they did a lot of great work around developing content standards for a model mental health training program. So if you'll recall, there was a policy, several laws in place in 2017 that required schools to adopt some sort of training on different subjects. So that's suicide prevention, substance abuse, general mental health, and schools were just overwhelmed. Districts were overwhelmed, school boards, this was just a lot. And so this working group put forth some recommendations for LEAs to adopt mental health training programs so that it's up to them, but at the same time they will be equipped with what's best practice. So you'll find those in the report. I can always go over them right now if you like, if that's, I can review them real quick. They're super simple. Overview. Each LEA and charter school will develop a plan to promote mental health, safety, wellness, and success of students through a coordinated continuum system of services and supports. The whole point of that is because we didn't want schools to feel like they had to do suicide prevention this year, substance abuse this year. It would have been more a part of a comprehensive plan. We wanted it to be relevant to the needs of the schools and districts, only limited to licensed professionals. And it's not limited to those topics, suicide prevention, substance abuse, etc. It's not limited to those, but those are the ones that we suggest schools cover every year, or teachers receive training on. And so we also wanted their best practice varied by training. We put that in the report. Again, it's not mandated, it's just this is best practice, so it's encouraged for you to follow it. We wanted to keep it in, the working group wanted to make sure that it was flexible enough so that if a school one year, maybe several students committed suicide one year, like that's a sign that something needs to be done. And so if it's not the year for suicide training, why would they do it? It doesn't work out that way. It needs to be flexible enough so that it can meet their own needs. The working group asked for them to develop a plan for assessing and improving upon the effectiveness of existing supports for all of these programs and populations, and just do a review every 3 years. Is this working? Is this what our students need? That kind of thing. Any questions about the report itself?
I read it, believe it or not.
No one?
All right, y'all are easy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I actually read it.
Mr. Chair, that concludes committee report.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Keenan. I tell you, we'll take a 10-minute break until 5 till 4. So we'll convene at 5 till 4.
terrible group.
Okay, we are now down to our last committee meeting of the day. If everyone will have a seat.
I think you're without, it sounds like you may be with, are you good? All right, folks.
Okay, we are now reconvened and we'll move to our last committee of the day, the Business Operations Committee, and I'll turn to that committee's chair, Mr. Duncan.
Thank you. On behalf of Todd Chastain, we present the Business Operations Committee reports, and we have two items, one for action, one for discussion, a new business item, update on contracts, and then two consent agenda items. Our first action item is a policy amendment having to do with school improvement competitive funds, and this is really a follow-up to the discussion we had at our last meeting. Chris Vecchione is here. If there are any questions teed off our discussion at the last meeting, Chris is glad to respond to them. Otherwise, if everybody recalls that discussion is content, I don't know that we need to discuss it further, but don't want to cut off discussion if there's still pending thoughts. All right, not seeing any, then we'll move forward to item number 2, which is discussion on an amendment to SBE policy CNTR 002 and intent to contract procedures, and Tamika Dunn is going to make the presentation to us on this proposed policy. Welcome, Tamika.
Thank you, and good afternoon to each of you. Today, we are here just to update you on our efforts to improve procurement here at DPI and to go over a few minor changes that we would like to see made to the existing policy. Today, I'm going to cover our delegation of authority, workflow improvements, intent to contract and policy changes, and go over the goals and expectations for this fiscal year and give you an update as to where we are right now. In September, Deputy Superintendent Katherine Johnson presented this slide to you all. Given our delegation of authority provided to us with our State Purchasing Contract Office. Our authority is $10,000. With the Department of Information Technology, our authority is at $25,000. So in an effort to enhance the improvement of the workflow with requisitions and also contracts, we have revamped how we would like to approve requisitions and to begin processing contracts. And what we have done when requisitioners enter into e-procurement to begin the contract process, it's always approved by the immediate supervisor. How we have chosen to, or are proposing to enhance this workflow is we've added budget to the beginning of the approval flow. And what this will allow us to do is to actually be able to see what funds are available or if any funds are available and if we actually need to proceed with pursuing this contract or not. If the funds are available, budget will then approve, and we have now added our CFO to our approval flow. It will then go to Ms. Barbara Roper for her approval from there as the CFO of DPI. From there, it would move into, if it's over $10,000 but under $25,000, we'd like to have all the deputies of each section here at DPI to continue to be a part of the approval flow, so it will go to them. What we are proposing is that if it's under $25,000, that the superintendent can use a designee, which would be the deputy, to approve those contracts for him, and anything over $25,000, of course, would be sent to the superintendent for approval. When work reaches purchasing, how we start the process, we do a bid process, and when contracts come in for approval, we have, according to the slide here, what we would like to do to process those workflows is we would like to have the CFO to continue to sign off on all of our contracts. If it's under $25,000, we would like to propose that the deputy superintendent can sign in place of the superintendent, and then anything over $25,000, the superintendent would continue to sign off on all of those. So you may say, where is legal involved in all of this in procurement? And so I would just like to assure you that our legal department is involved. Typically when we bring legal in is actually when a contract has already gone out for advertisement and has come back in We send the RFP to our legal department to review all the exceptions and the erratas that we may have, or any general problems that may have come up in our evaluation period. And it's not just our legal team that's involved in this process as well. It's also the legal team from our State Purchase and Contract Office, as well as the Department of Information Technology. So we have a whole team of attorneys reviewing within our department and outside of our department as well. So as we move into the intent to contract and the policy changes, proposed changes that we would like to make here, we just would like to see that the policy and everything be consistent with how we're operating right now. We have condensed our intent to contract down from 3 pages to 2 pages. And we'd like to move into an effort of having things submitted electronically versus paper. And this is a way to also enhance the procurement flow in establishing contracts by doing this electronically. So we are proposing to take this intent to contract form and actually have it attached to the requisition, but as it goes through the approval flow, that it be approved that way. And so what this does is it takes proposed contracts and it automatically puts it into a pending status once it reaches the procurement office, because we're gaining approval as it's approved in the e-procurement workflow. And as far as the board changes are concerned, that we kind of just looked at, it's not really a change. We just decided to just kind of enhance a little bit and just condense the wording here. What we would like to do is just, we're just simplifying what it says. We're going to be providing the same information to you all each month. We like to just be able to present the material and how you received your current material right now, so it's all in one centralized location and you're not having to go to more than one place to receive our monthly reports. And also, as I mentioned earlier, we've just taken, not taken away proposed contracts, but it's more or less going into a pending status versus proposed as it reads right now. So our goals and expectations, just to give you an update here, we have made some great progress since this slide was presented back in September. As far as the review and update for internal policies and procedures, this is in process currently. We are working on doing trainings here at DPI, so we're hoping to have all of our processes and policies completely updated by the end of January, so that we can present this new material that we have to the staff in February when we decide to do training classes. The Create Contract Administration and Management Guide, this has actually been completed and we just need to distribute it to the staff. The next 3 bullets, as well as the bullet on the end here, I'd like to just kind of combine those all together. We have created a contract management system since the last update for procurement was given in September. That system has been created in SharePoint. And what we have done, it was around October of this year when the system was built for us. So since then, we have been going back to the beginning of this fiscal year and entering all of our contracts into that database. And the goal is to continue to go back to prior years to have all of our information put into the system. So what this system is going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to track our contracts, track expiration dates. It's going to allow us to formulate reports to be able to send out to business owners anywhere from 120 days or longer than that if we need to start the process of either renewing current contracts or reestablishing contracts that may be getting ready to expire. One of the other things that we also are in the middle of doing right now is we're working with our IT department to possibly give us a separate drive right now to where we can go to an electronic filing versus trying to do a paper filing system. And we would like to move in this direction because the state of North Carolina is actually moving into what we call is NC bids. where all of our solicitations will be received electronically. So we want to be in compliance with what the state is now moving to. We want to also head into that direction. And so that is something that we are working with our IT department on to fulfill that need as well. And I think one of the last bullets on here to report to is to expand implementation or electronic signature flow. So as I stated earlier, we're trying to move to more of an electronic signature process. And in doing so right now, we're using DocuSign to utilize that. And what we are finding is that versus paper versus the electronic using DocuSign, it just helps the approval process to go by a little bit faster than what it would by submitting paper for someone to sign off on. And this is all that I have for you today. Do you have any questions for me?
Questions from board members? Yes, Mr. Buxton.
Duncan, Don, thank you for a really good presentation. Just a couple clarifying. It might not be part of this policy, and I'm not suggesting this is an issue going on. I just know with volume of contracts at a place like the department deals with, should we have in this policy or in another policy something about validation of deliverables? So we know before what we contracted for, before we cut them a check for the invoice, we know that they've delivered on the goods and services.
So one of the things that we, it's actually already in the policy, and it's something that we are trying to like re-emphasize, is that we set up payment modules. So we don't pay a vendor all of their money at one time, but we have modules set up to where we pay them according to the work that they have done. So we tier the payments according to them meeting their deliverables.
Right, so it sounds like that's addressed. Second one is, this is for all money, right? Federal funding, state public school fund, all.
This is for everything, yes, sir.
So especially on state public school fund, and Mr. Chairman, this may be a question for you and committee, whether there's a threshold above 25,000, probably significantly above 25,000, where there's a role for the board. It's just a question I ask because of, especially with state public school fund money, that's district money and state money, whether there's a level of a threshold where we would be engaged in that decision.
Good question.
And I don't have a threshold I'm thinking of in my mind, just wondering if we ought to be accountable.
As everyone will recall, we're now in the process of looking at our policies and procedures consistent with the Supreme Court opinion that was issued last year in order to establish those. It strikes me that that consideration, I heard some assent when you said that, to at least look at that question, is perhaps something we should look at before we finalize these changes, to see what the board's will is on that, not knowing what it is. I know that's a common policy in lots of board settings, because the flip side would be you would have no board oversight ultimately on any purchase, and so there's what most boards like to have some, as you said, fairly significant number where oversight would come into play. So I throw out to the board any thoughts that people have about whether that should not be part of our board review of the policies, which of course this is meant to facilitate the process of making the contracts easier to work through. Anyone else have comments on that or thoughts?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Chairman
thank you,
Davis.
Mr. John. Duncan, I'll just say as a local board member, that was customary. The superintendent, we had a very similar policy as this, but there was a limit as to which the superintendent then needed to come to the board. And that actually, because of the volume, decreases dramatically when you get above a certain level. It really didn't impact the pace or workflow, because I think what you're proposing here is exactly the direction we need to go. But what it did do was provide a degree of transparency and frankly support to the superintendent in the local district in bringing the larger contracts, which nearly always get greater public scrutiny and questions. And so then the board is armed and equipped to support those decisions. So I think it's just a good practice, again, based on my experience as a local board. Maybe other board members have different opinions, but that's been my experience.
This is a discussion item, not up for action this month, so the committee will take under consideration the comments that are being made about this and see if we can come back with something for the board to consider.
The other item I had caught my eye was that the last sentence on the proposed policy does remove the words "or proposed contract," and I know members of the board are very sensitive to honoring the procurement process and the validity and the distance we need to have in that process. But I think it's the way we're doing it now with the opportunity for board members to understand what's in a proposed contract, I think should be preserved as opposed to being taken out of the policy. That's just my opinion.
Essentially, what that means, I think we all look at the proposed contract list when it's out there on a monthly basis, and if there's something we have a question about, it's been asked. We don't have many questions about that, but occasionally we have one.
And I've never known that to cause an issue with a contract or impede the procurement process.
So it would mean we were getting an answer before the contract was entered into, as opposed to a presentation after. So again, we can look at that between now and bringing it back next month. Yes,
Mr. Chairman, to be clear, this policy pertains to both contracts for service as well as purchases.
So currently how this reads is the policy says for all, but the intent, the contract just states for services, and that is how we have been operating. So every month when you see a report from us, we're just reporting services only. And really, to be honest with you, probably about 97% of what we procure here is services. We have a very small number of commodities that are actually purchased here at the department.
But this does cover that other 10%, the procurement. If it's, you said 90% is contract for service, then there's a purchase, and is that under this same policy? Does this policy,
I think you're asking, is the commodity purchase under the same policy, or is it under something different?
No, this is just proposed just for services only.
services, so, okay.
Right. So, a question that would be asked what would constitute commodities? For example, would that be educational supplies if you were?
Right, we're talking like supplies, like office supplies, we're talking furniture, any type of equipment, we're talking things of that nature.
So maybe for clarity, is this policy intended to cover that as well, or is there a separate policy for the commodity items?
If you would like for us to include something on commodities, I'm sure we would be open to going back to see what we can come up with for that, if that would make things easier.
Even though it's separate policy.
All right, I'm looking at the board, it sounds like they'd like the committee to explore that before we come back, so we will also do that. Any other questions? These are all very helpful questions. Any others? All right, Tamika, thank you very much for the report.
Thank you.
And the work you've done on this. Our next item is new business, the Business Modernization Agency Modernization Update, and that's Dr. Spano, and I believe Ms. Gossage may be part of the presentation. I give this disclaimer on behalf of the presenters as they start. Because this is at a certain place in the process, the presentation by necessity will be shorter than it might be otherwise, and it will be subject to follow-up presentations to give greater detail.
Thank you for the clarity, Vice Chairman Duncan. I'll be quick. I know I'm the last presenter. For those that were here last time, I like this chart because it highlights kind of the whole program in one picture. We talked about the PMO being the overriding, controlling aspect of the program. EBSAC being an advisory committee, it's meeting in Greensboro in February. That focuses on the LEA side. We talked about LEA modernization last time, the ERP, RFP. We talked about data transparency, management analysis. Today, we're going to talk about agency modernization, and I'll be quick about it, which represents the State Educational Institute. We've done a high-level review and a detailed inventory of our systems and business needs. We're working on the flows. It's in process. It's a lot of reasons why it's in process and not complete. Not excuses, but there are a lot of reasons. We had Ernst & Young do a study. We factored that in. We've had the state go out on many procurements. We had to wait for those to complete, and those are rounding up and completing. and we were off doing the very, very large state ODS. We completed the operational data store. It's up and running. It's been 100% available since it's been running. Reporting's faster, data's cleaner. So that part is really crucial as we move forward to modernize the agency. So now we have a decoupling, if you will, between the LEA and the SEA in the form of an ODS. So anything we do doesn't impact the LEAs, anything the LEAs do doesn't impact the agency. So it was an important step and it was worth the wait. So what we've been doing in the past couple of weeks, and I'd like to do a shout out and a thank you to the COO, Catherine, the CIO, Michael, and the CFO, Barbara, for freeing up some really crucial resources when they're shorthanded. And I've picked up a few people in the financial technology services to do deep dives on this, and they still have their day jobs, but they've been putting in a lot of work on modernization, and I'm working on getting some more financial resources out of the CFO to commit to this. So everybody's committed, the resources are moving. What I've got here is a ICE chart. Don't bother trying to look at it up on the screen. You have it in front of you, you have it in the minutes. What it says here is for all the programs we're looking at, our first approach is to look at what is the state doing. Why would we go off and develop something from scratch when the state is off doing that and they have way more resources than we do? So our first blush is to see what the state is doing and see if we can't use that. And so every time we think we want a new system, our first question is, what does the state do? Now, that doesn't mean 100% of the time it'll work, but with some negotiations with the IT, we think we can get a lot of what we need out of the state, saving money, saving time, and getting us out of the business of supporting IT. Doesn't mean IT goes away. IT still has a very large job to do. It'll be a smaller, more compact, different organization. Catherine's team and the CIO are working on that. I'm sure you'll hear about that in the future. So these are just some of the things. I won't read them off. You can read them at your leisure. The idea here is we want to decouple the LEAs from the day-to-day stuff of producing reports for us to produce reports. So they'll do their day jobs. We'll grab the data into the ODS. We'll do our day jobs. And we won't have them having to stop what they're doing, which is teaching our children, running our LEAs, to give us what we need to do our jobs. Vice versa. If they need something from us, they'll just pull it down from the ODS. So that is the underlying mission of modernization. We've seen some early results in the ODS, and I wish the system architect were here under Michael. He's gotten some great emails about how fast reports are running, which is really good. We're not dependent on a single vendor to produce our data anymore for student information. That they still produce the information, but now it's in a different place, so we don't have to get it from the same place that's running our schools. So it frees them up to do their job better. So I went through that really quickly because I know I'm up against the time fence. Is there any questions that I can answer that you have since last time? Seems like we just were here right before Christmas last year. So, any questions, Chairman, Vice Chair?
Yes, any questions from board members on this? All right. What's a reasonable time frame, both in terms of the work being done with the LEAs and the agency modernization, to come back when you can talk a little, at least a little more deeply about where we are?
We're in an actual ERP modernization RFP. That's coming to a conclusion. I can't give you the date yet. So I would say if we can put this off at least 2 months to 3 months, I would have a much better response on both of those.
So we should start from March and see where we sit for that.
And I'm always free for phone calls. I'm in the directory. My mobile's in the directory. If you have questions, just call me. Is that okay? Is that allowed? If it is, just call me. I mean, it's easier for me just to answer the phone and tell you what you need to know.
Right. So. Well, no, this is very helpful, but we understand there's limitations right now because of where things sit in the process. So thank you for catching up. The board members are obviously very interested in this, so we thank you for the report.
And I'm glad for that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we have a report on executed contracts that you've all had and a planned contracts report. If there are any questions about that. And then finally, there are 2 consent agenda items that we have. One of them is a policy amendment. It's a technical correction with respect to the formula grants for school improvement. It's a very minor correction. Second one is demolition of residence, asset 34, and it's at the School of the Deaf at Morganton. It is, as I understand it, a very small structure. It's well beyond its shelf life. It's not used for anything. Given its configuration and age, it's not deemed useful for anything. and it's deemed that it would be wise for it to be removed at some point from the property. So the exploration is being made of potential demolition of that small structure. My recollection is it's around 1,000 square feet, or it's not a large structure. So, any other questions on that? Then we are done. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Duncan. That concludes our committee's reports. My thanks to board members, Superintendent Johnson, DPI staff, and other contributors for today's meeting. I'll now ask for a motion to go into closed session, and note for the audience and online listeners that following closed session, the January 9, 2019 meeting will adjourn immediately. Is there a motion?
Yes, I move that the State Board of Education go into closed session to discuss personnel matters and to consult with our attorneys on attorney-client privilege matters, including 1, Hope County versus State of North Carolina, North Carolina State Board of Education, and 2, Alpha Academy, Inc. versus North Carolina State Board of Education. And as I make the motion, I'll ask for the ability to be recused from any closed session discussion on the Hope County matter in light of my participation on the Governor's Commission.
Thank you, Vice Chair Duncan. Is there a second? Second by Mr. Keenan. Dr. Townsend Smith, will you call the roll?
Mr. Buxton,
Yes.
Ms. Chemnitz,
Yes.
Mr. Keenan,
Yeah.
Mr. McDevitt,
Yes.
Ms. White,
Yes.
Vice Chair Duncan,
Yes.
Chair Davis.
Yes. So the motion carries. We will enter closed session at 4:30. So this adjourns today's meeting.